the key in hybrid warfare is video. And video is much more powerful than the kinetic war. So Israel's winning the kinetic war, losing the hybrid war. Sinwar is still controlling it from his grave. And the only tell of this is that you still hold hostages in Gaza, Hamas does, and you're getting people to give a victory chant from the river to the sea, celebrating a genocide that has yet to happen.
I think that we should not platform historical revisionists who go back in time and find a fact and then tell it in a certain way to spin the narrative of what we should know about events.
I feel like both in this debate and in the debate with Douglas Murray, it almost kind of feels like the analogy I'd use is like if two fighters agreed to fight, you know, two guys in the UFC, they agree to fight. And so they show up under the lights and you get into the cage and I put my hands up and then the other guy puts his hands down and starts telling me what a better fighter he is than me. And you're like, okay, well then let's do it.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Okay, so it's fascinating to me that we can get to a point in modern society these days where we have a debate about a debate, and we have a guy sitting in a room outside of his house reacting to this and posting that online. How absurd is this video right here? But we've got some Piers Morgan, we've got Dave Smith versus Douglas Murray. We've got a debate talking about the debate, talking about other things. This is going to be pretty good. We're going to get into all kind of philosophical discussions, morality. We're going to get into all kinds of stuff. As you can see with that intro, we're going to get pretty deep off into it right here. So y'all buckle up, smash that like button for me, subscribe if you're new around here. I would greatly appreciate that. Hey, join the channel, by the way. We've got memberships now, and you can do that if you so choose. That would be awesome if you could do that. I would be eternally grateful to anybody and everybody that would choose to do that. That would also be great. So y'all buckle up, and let's go ahead and get into it.
Explain why you felt that Dave Smith lost this debate.
Sure. I wouldn't say it had anything to do with Douglas. I would have to say it was the statements that Dave Smith made during the podcast, which highlight, and I won't get into the credentialism as Dave's quoting four-star generals or who's an expert, who's not. I do research. I think Dave tells jokes for a living. I had a problem with the statements that were made, and then how do you come to that conclusion, which really does get to the podcaster world versus other individuals on how did you come to that opinion or that declarative statement, like Israel is intentionally killing civilians? I mean, there's like 10 different ways you can do research. You can do comparative, case study. And I think this is what Douglas was saying. If you haven't been there, then how are you getting to your conclusion? You ethnographic, you can go there and do interviews in Gaza like both Douglas and I have done with soldiers. What's going on? How are you doing it? You can do even historical archival data research. That's not what it appears that Dave does, and it seems to be more of a historical revisionism. Take a piece of data that you got and then tell a really convincing narrative on how you got to your conclusion. But as somebody who has students, I mean, correlation is not causation is that famous phrase. When that story is actually just a lot of correlation and inferences, how did you get to your conclusion? How do you do that research? Forget the expertise and the credentialism. You're making a statement like it's true, and I know Dave's anti-war, and that's great, but you can't be anti-factual, and Dave, without Douglas, just made a bunch of not true statements.
Give some of the key examples of what you think were
care to share
completely factually inaccurate.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think the over one, which is what me and Dave were talking over X, is that Israel is intentionally killing civilians, especially children. That's not a factual statement at all because it doesn't even include the base information. So it's almost like, you know, you just don't know the information you need to know to make that judgment. And, you know, let's forget comparing it to a domestic situation like Dave continues to do on Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman, others. Like if somebody killed my kids and I know where he's at and I go to that apartment building and I kill everybody in it, that's murder. And that's what Israel is doing. And that's not true. Even you, Piers, have commented about Israel striking something and saying, look at the number of civilians, that's not acceptable. That's not how war works. It's not even how you would assess that situation because it completely rules out what the law of war says about proportionality, about assessing What is the target? Who is that individual? What's his value, concrete value? And then, which a lot of people leave out, is what precautions did Israel take, like we just saw recently, of calling everybody in the building saying, look, the terrorist is using this building for a military purpose. You must leave. You must get out of this area, or all the other steps, these civilian harm mitigation measures. So that one's a really huge one, but there are other ones, like when Dave said that there are more children to have died in this war than any modern war. That's just, of course, Douglas called that out, but there is a whole list of them, from the blockade, from the occupation, like all of these things were just counterfactual and not a logic that leads to a conclusion, but he's really convincing, and that's what I have a problem with.
You know, I just love how he starts this thing off with, Dave's not an expert, but I'm not going to get into credentialism. But Dave's not an expert. Hang on, I don't really like this setup. Y'all, give me just a second, you guys. He basically starts this thing off, I'm not going to do a thing, and then proceeds to do that said thing. Now, what is really going on here? We're dipping off into the philosophical here for a second. Okay, so what's basically being argued here is two totally different points. And what Dave is trying to get these people to understand is, look, what the law, you know, the wartime law, the proportionalities and all this other nonsense that he was talking about, it's not moral, right? You can't just, you know, remove this set of laws and replace it with a different set of laws and think the morality of the situation changes. That's not how reality works, my friends. What Dave is trying to argue here is that, like, give his example of, you know, blowing up a house with a bunch of people in it because something's, you know, someone slighted you in a certain way or killed one of your family members or blah, 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 blah. That in war, that's not murder, but in regular life, civilian life, that would absolutely be murder. Now, what they are trying to do here is, once again, like I said, is replace laws and saying that, okay, because it's wartime, well, it's okay to do this. And Dave is making the argument that morality doesn't change just because the situation changes. Now, I'm not sure how I feel about that, to be honest with you, because, you know, I understand, you know, how wars are conducted. What we really need to look at here is, how is this war being conducted? Like, traditionally, I would totally agree with the side that we have a different set of laws for war. Look, I get it. When you have two military combatants going at each other, you have a certain set of laws you have to abide by, blah, 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 blah. But that's only a recent development. And they try to bring in historical fact from war, right? Back in the day, we didn't have these civilian casualties like we do these days. It was much more brutal. And honestly, like, sure, if you have a battlefield, like take the Civil War, for instance, you got lines of people or whatever, they're just going at each other, or the Revolutionary War, or, you know, the medieval wars and stuff like that, right? You got lines of people, and they're out here on this open field, and they just go at it, right? There's no civilians being harmed in any sort of way in any of that. However, outside of that, you have, then on the other hand, these armies coming through towns in enemy territory, and they'll just raze them to the freaking ground, just destroying everything, killing civilians without shedding a tear, without a care in the world about what they're doing. That's very brutal, and we don't have that these days. But what you have going on in Israel here is a totally different situation. This is kind of the clash between modern military and a classic trench warfare-ish kind of thing going on, where you have these terrorists and they're in the urban setting, right? And they're dug in under churches, under schools, and how do we deal with that, right? So the morality of the situation, you have these enemy combatants using civilians as human shields. And a lot of people are upset that these human shields are getting killed. And look, like I said, I'm not 100% certain where I fall on this, but getting back to the argument here, where Dave is trying to point out that killing of civilians is intentional. And he makes a good point. He makes the good rebut right here. And this is what I'm trying to convey also, that yes, it is intentional. It definitely is Israel is definitely intending to kill these people, because for the simple fact they're warning these people, hey, we're going to bomb this because terrorists are there. Now, we could get into how much sense does that make, because then the terrorists are just going to leave, let them bomb the building. But that's not happening, is it? No, that's not happening, because civilians are still getting killed. Terrorists are still getting killed. So it's like, how do we resolve this situation, right? How do we root out Hamas and not kill civilians? That's the question. Now, I love this idea that Dave is arguing past these people, and they just keep bringing it back to, oh, well, military doctrine is such, and military law is such, and international law, and blah, 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 blah. But that's not the argument, folks. Let's let Dave go ahead and work this out.
All right, Dave, your response.
Sure. Well, okay. I mean, I do think that, like, you do a lot of this, as Douglas did, a lot of this poisoning of the well stuff and saying you tell jokes and I do research, and you could say this isn't credentialism all you want to, but it's really a lot before you start taking on an actual argument. In fact, it wasn't until the follow-up question that you pointed anything out. So to the analogy that I'm making, and you know, as you were quoting me on Twitter the other day, I'm not saying that I'm not familiar, although I'm not claiming to have your level of expertise with international humanitarian law, or you can assert that war works a different way. I'm talking about something much more fundamental. What I'm saying is that Douglas is making the claim, and many others are, that Israel's killing of civilians is unintentional. And I'm talking about a very basic philosophical concept of morality, of intentionality, and that by what people mean when they say intentional, that if this was done domestically, we would consider it intentional. The point is that war, yes, look, there's been the Geneva Convention, there's international humanitarian law. It goes back to the mid-19th century, was codified into law after World War II. I think that's a good thing. I think it's a step in the right direction. But this is all a politician or a group of politicians declaring a word, and the fact that there are lines drawn on a map does not in any way magically transform morality or the basic philosophical concept of intent. And even in your example there, if I were to give out pamphlets, give out a warning, tell everybody I'd really like you to leave, and then they didn't, and I blew up a building, we would consider that intentional murder. Now, my point, I think a lot of times people object to almost what the implications of this way of looking at the world might be, but forget all of that for a second. I'm just talking about how human beings think about these things. And when you talk about an intentional killing, now, by the way, I should also stipulate that it's not as if that's the case in every single one of these strikes that Israel's taken. And we've gotten all types of evidence about this. And there's quite a number of cases, hundreds of cases, where they're waiting for terrorists to go back into a residential building and then attacking the building, suspected terrorists, I should say. But regardless, none of this is even really the point. The point is that on a very basic human level, and I would also think this is completely incompatible with Christianity, although I'm not trying to lecture anybody about that, but there is no micro and macro morality. There is no micro or macro intentionality. These are human concepts. And if you are dropping a bomb and you know that there are women and children on the receiving end of that bomb, then that was done intentionally. And I think this is the reality of war. And I think if we're going to have a conversation about this, we should deal with it in reality.
I think Dave is just totally correct on this, right? Like, this is, the intent was to murder people, right? Whether it's enemy combatants, whether it's otherwise. Sure, you might not want civilians to get harmed, but if you know the potentiality for civilians to be harmed is there and you do it anyway, right? This is bared out in law, by the way. Like, you know, if you get into a vehicle, for instance, and you drive down the road, you know that if you run into another car and you murder somebody, and then that car hits another car, that falls upon you. The amount of collateral damage doesn't really matter because collateral damage exists. Intent exists. You didn't intend to murder anybody when you got into that vehicle and drive, but the possibility was there, the potentiality for somebody to get harmed because you got behind the wheel of a car, right? This is the argument here. And, you know, once again, you could make the argument that this is war and, you know, in war, we allow for these things because we understand collateral damage, and we can't hold the person that dropped the bomb or pulled the trigger culpable for those actions, right? We have chains of command. They were told to do this. They were following orders. But once again, it is what level do we accept these concepts, right? What level do we accept collateral damage at this point? And this is the point Dave is trying to get at, that he believes, and I believe as well, that, you know, if there's a pathway that we can root out Hamas and get rid of Hamas and minimize the casualties, it doesn't seem like that's what Israel is doing here. It seems like they are doing a good job. To be honest with you, I'm not saying that I'm against Israel on this. I really wish that they would calm down. This is my opinion. I wish they would calm down and stop killing so many civilians. There we go. Get that out of the way. But I'm on the side of Israel on this. I think, Hamas needs to be rooted out. I am a firm believer in special ops, for crying out loud. I love special ops. Wish we had more of those. I wish, and I understand this might be a bit naive. I've never been in the military. I've never been into a war situation. It's maybe a bit naive. I really don't care because, logic works this way. But, I believe that it would be much harder, by the way, to send in special ops to go and root out Hamas instead of just dropping a bomb. Just dropping a bomb is a whole hell of a lot easier to do, right? I mean, let's all admit that right quick. It's a lot easier for Israel to drop a bomb than it would be to send in scores after scores of special ops to go in and root all this up. It would be messy, it would be bloody, and there would be civilians lost. That would be collateral damage, in other words. That way it would be much less. It would be on a much lower scale. But, there's all these arguments, and I love these arguments these people are making back and forth, and they're great because we need to work this out. I think a lot of these ideas, like how do you legislate morality is what I'm getting at here. Like, how do you put this philosophical idea of it's intentional murder when you drop a bomb on a building knowing you're going to kill civilians? How do you legislate for that? That's the problem that we face. How do we legislate that into war? That would neuter, essentially, any military's ability to conduct a war. So, how do we fix this? Can we fix this? Yes, naively, let's just stop going to war, right? That's the fix. Let's just stop going to war. Yeah, it's not that easy, folks. It really isn't. But I think it's a good thing that these ideas are worked out. And, just coming in and using the excuse, well, this is international law, humanitarian law. We've got military doctrine we need to abide by. Using that as an excuse for collateral damage, I think, is just poor judgment, and it ignores the morality of the situation, right? It's an excuse for people to just say, well, it's a lot easier if we just drop a bomb on these people instead of sending in the special ops, who, these people might be killed, the special ops guys. So how do we balance all these things, right? Like, this is why I can't really get on a single side on any of this, because you send in the special ops, then you're putting these people's lives in danger. But you got to look at it like this. Okay, so did these special ops people know what they were getting themselves into when they volunteered for this specific job? You got to look at, there's a lot to look at here, and we could go all day. We could go real deep on the philosophical on this one. But I think it still comes down to, I think these discussions need to happen. I think these debates need to happen. This morality aspect of war needs to be injected into military doctrine, for crying out loud. So we can maybe one day get to a point where we can eliminate war. I think that would be a very good thing. If we could get to that point one day, to where we get these people, around the world to stop picking up a gun and start picking up a microphone, for crying out loud. Let's put something down on paper where we agree, draw these lines, whatever you got to do. Let's agree that flinging bullets at each other is not the right answer. I think that's a place we need to get to, and I think that can only be done through discussions like this, injecting morality into the philosophical situation that we have going on. Injecting morality into law, essentially. But that's a slippery slope. I ain't gonna lie. It's one of those omnidirectional slippery slopes that just go in all directions. You go too far one way, hang on, we got fascism. You don't go far enough, hang on, we got anarchy. So yeah, we need to be careful on these. But I think, if we bring, just cold-blooded law, bring a little bit of morality into that, I think we can make people's lives a lot better, progress our society in such a way that we can actually eliminate war one day. But those first steps need to be taken, and I think this is a good step in the right direction. Let's keep going.
So, look, yeah, that's the case study or comparative model that you could do the research on. How does this compare to anything else? And it doesn't, right? The 20 years of preparing Gaza for war, the 400 miles of tunnels, the human sacrifice strategy, because both sides actually have legal obligations. And when Hamas says, I need the death of my women and children, that's not right. So the data about what is the population. So one, I don't want to be, heartless about it. And every death of a child is terrible, but you're evaluating anybody who's below the 18 as a child, as in, that Hamas has basically charged. I joined the military at 17. Am I a child? And Hamas deploys. The average age of a Hamas recruit right now is 16 and a half. We've seen them put weapons in hands of very young children. You have combatant and you have non-combatant. Is there any comparable status to the demographic of Gaza? No. Is there any comparison to where another country, Egypt, refuses to let even those that want out from the combat areas, and Israel, who took weeks to evacuate the civilians from the areas they're going into? So absolutely, there are so many here, but back to Dave's comment, which it stands on itself, explaining what he doesn't know about war or the laws of war, about them being codified and when they went into effect, or this is a simple question of morality that, war should be no killing of civilians. That should be it. You two military should go find your place to fight and just have it out. That's not the history of war from the creation, literally, of city-states going out and everything.
Again, I think
you want to get into the frameworks to judge. No, the frameworks to judge war. We as societies, all the societies of war, the Geneva Conventions is one example, have decided here are the boundaries of brutality of war. Like, we don't bomb innocent civilians. And you cannot say, I don't care what your Haaretz articles say, you're not going to show me that Israel has targeted civilians, intentionally killing civilians, when I can show you measures that Israel has taken that no military in the history of war have taken to get civilians out of harm's way so they can target that terrorist. You once said on a podcast that if the terrorist is holding a baby and shooting at you, then of course you can kill the terrorist. And unfortunately, what they're doing is wrong. But then I understand that when we have cases of Hamas doing that, holding children so nobody will shoot at them, or going underneath a hospital, a school, a mosque, doing what we call lawfare. You have to have an understanding of the evolutions of the law of war, how it is adjudicated. When you say evidence, I mean evidence, not TikTok videos. I mean actual evidence of what did the person dropping the commander know? What did he do to prevent it? What time did he do it? What type of munition did he use? Dave's statement stand on his own of showing that he doesn't know the foundations of war, even if it's what you call a just war or just execution of the war. You're just not communicating that you know enough to make a statement like that. I'm just philosophically talking about killing civilians is wrong. That's what the law of war says. It says don't target civilians. Yeah. What Hamas did on October 7th. It doesn't say 0 civilians will die in a war. There's a precaution law of war. There is the feasible things you do to prevent the civilian death. But you can't say Israel hasn't done that. And I'm saying, based on my research, not an appeal to expertise, going there, interviewing IDF soldiers, commanders, Netanyahu himself, I'm saying Israel is not targeting or intentionally trying to kill civilians. They're doing the opposite more than anybody else.
Okay, so as we can clearly see, that I think they're talking past each other on this. But sure, you know, as a matter of fact, to add to that argument, there's been examples of Hamas handing a freaking 8-year-old a damn rifle and sending them out there to the slaughter. It doesn't make any sense what Hamas is doing. And you know, I take it back to this: like, how do we combat that? You know, Dave used the analogy of, you know, a UFC fight, right? Let's go ahead and do that. So what we have here with Israel and Hamas, we've got like the top of the top, the best of the best, right? You know, Tito Ortiz or somebody, you know, comes into the ring with, I don't know, both hands tied behind his back and 15-pound leg weights on each leg. And then Hamas comes into the ring is, you know, some scrawny like me, for instance, some out-of-shape, middle-aged guy that doesn't really know much about fighting, but yet I've got in my corner, I've got a metal chair, I've got a baseball bat, I've got all these tools that I can beat Tito Ortiz over the head with. Who do you think's going to come out on top? Do you think Tito Ortiz is going to be able to take me down when I have a freaking chair I can just beat him with? I can stay at a distance and throw these things at him, right? Like, that's what Israel is trying to fight against here. And, you know, to say that they haven't gone above and beyond expectations on this, I think they've done a decent job. But it's once again, it's bringing it back to the intentionality here. Was the intention to kill terrorists? Yes. Did they know that civilians could possibly get their arms blown off in the process? I think the answer to that is definitely yes. They knew this going into it. But what do you do about that, right? Like, do you just leave it alone? Do you just let Hamas run amok? I think, once again, having these discussions is a very good idea. Injecting morality into the situation, because morality is a part of reality, for crying out loud. Like, sure, the you know, United States citizens, well, mostly aren't in Israel, in Gaza, on the ground. Sure, there's some kidnapped civilians over there that Hamas is still holding hostage. As to my understanding, I don't know if they've been released yet. I know most of them have, but okay, so most of us aren't on the ground over there, but it's the reality of the situation these days, right? Like, back in the day, unless you were directly involved in that war, you really didn't see the brutality of war, right? Even going back to the second Iraq invasion, for crying out loud, what we see on TV is not what the soldiers on the ground see. And that changes people, and they come back a very different person. This is why most soldiers that see combat, close quarters combat like that, they come back, they have PTSD, they have really bad mental problems. How do you think, and these are trained soldiers, for crying out loud, it deeply affects people. So the fact that we get to see this, even though it's through video, I think that has a profound effect on our society. I think that is profoundly affecting our young people these days, right? And society is, you know, it's starting to break down in certain ways. The fringes are starting to crumble, and we're starting to see it getting slowly chipped away, that people are much more open and okay with violence and vandalism and all this nonsense within our own country, in our own society, because of some of this. Right? It definitely is a factor. It's not the whole factor, but it definitely is a factor that we see this violence. We see all this stuff perpetuated on TV, just constantly on a daily basis, and it affects people. So I think, you know, we need to keep up this air of morality that, yes, we need to say these are very bad things, that you can't just go and kill civilians for no apparent reason. But it's not no apparent reason, right? It's to get a terrorist. But it is, to what degree are we satisfied with civilian casualties just to attain a goal of eliminating Hamas? You know, how do we live with ourselves, in other words, if we're okay with women and children getting blown apart to attain a goal of eliminating, right? Like, there's a lot to be discussed here, and I can't do that on this whole video, but, you know, it's like, we gotta weigh, we gotta balance, you know, how many civilian casualties are we willing to accept to eliminate another threat that could be potential civilian casualties in the future. I think that's what it all boils down to. And I think slowly, if we chip away at one, the other will, it'll be an exponential shift, in other words, in either direction. So we need to find some sort of balance here, but Eric Weinstein comes in on this, and, the debate shifts, so we're going to shift a little bit right here, but Eric Weinstein comes in and makes a really good point.
The concern that I have is there's no real solution if we try to solve this problem in terms of platforming, free speech, who's an expert, who isn't, what's the credential. We're not even being genuine, in my opinion, about what it is that we're talking about. Let's give a simple example. I can essentially guarantee you that 6 million people on the nose of Jewish faith were not killed during the Holocaust. I don't know what the number was, but the odds that it would have all of those round zeros and come in exactly where it does is negligible. Every time I hear somebody make that point, I worry, right? Because the idea is it's like somebody picking at the asbestos who isn't looking like a registered asbestos removal company. There's a way in which World War II settled in a particular way, which is, thank God we didn't appease infinitely. We had an absolute monster on our hands. There were extermination camps. Genocide matters as a word. We sat with Stalin despite our obvious differences, because sometimes you have to do. There's a certain sort of story about it that's kind of directionally true if imperfect, because it's too clean, it's too clear, et cetera, et cetera. What you see now is this mania for, hey, I found out all of these interesting facts. Did you know about the Rosenstrasse protest? What was that? Where women married to half Jewish men got their men back by protesting in Rosenstrasse, showing that the Nazis could be made to relent. No, I didn't know that. So now you're in a situation in which each kind of fact, whether it's the McCullum memo or the Rosenstrasse protest, is an opportunity to pick at the asbestos. And partially, it's not really a religion. And I talked to Dave about this morning privately. There's a French philosopher, I think his name is Renan, whose great quote is, "A nation is a group of people who have agreed to forget something in common." Unfortunately, we have a very simplistic notion at the moment that because we've been lied to by these elites, and boy, is that clear over the last several years, we are now deciding that we are going to pick at everything that might be a fiction, everything that might not be exactly true. And by the way, we have a new problem with X, which was formerly Twitter, which is that you cannot walk a foot in it without being covered in anti-Semitic leeches if your last name sounds like mine. And Dave, I've understood the same thing has been happening to you. We are not finding the formula for a good life. It's not coming about by censorship. It's not coming about by false expertise. And it's not coming about by an anonymous free-for-all where everybody is sharing everything at an equal level, and we have no ability to discern what's going on. And it's not being settled through debate or combat, Dave. And I agree with you on that.
Makes a really good point right there, that a lot of people these days, with the ubiquity of information on the internet and, people's, the inherent need to confirm your bias. When you see a bit of information and you go searching for more information to confirm said information, when you have this notion in your head, you're like, oh, I think this happened. So you go and search out information. That leads down the path of derangement. And we have a lot of deranged people these days. You have people out there, you get to talking about like fentanyl coming across the southern border or something like that. And within 30 seconds of trying to explain, their position on it, they end up on, Israel did it somehow, or it's the fault of the Jews, right? Like, no, come on. It's much bigger than that. It's broader than that. Step back for a second. But this is a problem. Once again, like I said, with the ubiquity of information, you can correlate anything and make causation from that. Just about, because there's so much information to confirm your own bias with this, and we all do it. I'm not immune to this, by the way, folks. I am definitely not immune to this. Now, neither are you. Although we try to navigate, through this information, this ubiquity of information on the internet to try to get to a position to where, we can confirm our own morality. It's morality confirmation, if you will. Confirmation of morality, however you want to put it. But, he brings up a really good point there, that we get these facts and then we try to pick away at these and say, oh, well, Donald Trump's tariffs are, it's a tax on you, blah, 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 blah. Well, the people that make that argument, oh, this is a bad thing because it's Donald Trump, or, it's a tax on you type of thing. Those arguments, they are ignoring the ramifications of what the tariffs actually do. And, people misconstrue my position on those tariffs all the time. They pretend that I don't know anything and blah, blah, blah. I'm all for it just because dear leader Donald Trump said it's okay. Is it just because he's doing it? No, of course not. Of course I know the prices are going to go up. But it's not necessarily just a tax on you. Not saying it's not a tax on you, right? But you got to look at everything in totality here, because it's going to be a tax on that corporation. It's going to have other ramifications. It's a negotiating tactic. It's this, it's that, it's blah, 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 blah. Sometimes we have to zoom out, right? Drop your preconceived notions of what you've been thinking and look at everything in totality. You got to listen to opposition opinions, for crying out loud. You got to listen to the other side. What you got to try to do sometimes is steel man your own arguments, right? If you have this notion in your head that Trump is a bad guy for the sake of being bad, oh, he's just in it for himself and his rich billionaire buddies. Sometimes you got to zoom out and think, go step by step if you've got to. Well, how does this actually benefit Trump? And blah, 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 and just continue down that line as if, Trump is doing this for completely benevolent purposes, right? Completely benevolent purposes. Just go the opposite direction sometimes. Sometimes we have to do that, right? Because it's good for our psyche to be balanced, for crying out loud. If we get to a place where we only think one thing, you get stuck in this endless loop of just being deranged with whatever the hell you're talking about right here, and you completely ignore reality at some point. You get to where certain facts will be skewed to where, and eventually you just don't even care about other facts. This happens on a constant basis, folks. And I think this is what has happened to our mainstream news, and why trust in mainstream news has completely gone away. They've just gotten so used to backing one side that they completely ignore reality. Just outright. They'll take a certain set of facts and they will just completely ignore certain facts and then give you these sets of facts to push you in a certain direction. Whether that's intentional or whether that's accidental, I have no idea what the intent behind these people are. But that is the result. That is what is going on, because this is what they do on a constant basis. And my very next video, by the way, is going to almost prove this. There'll be evidence for it, put it that way. We'll give it a little bit of, we'll be fair. I'm not going to say proof of anything, because, I've always been of the opinion that you can't prove hardly anything, right? But this was before the ubiquity of video. But it's really, really hard to prove something, right? Even with video. You could say, well, it's AI generated, or, they staged the video, blah, 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 blah. It's really hard to prove stuff. It just is. Take that idea and run with it for a second. How do you prove something, right? If somebody tells you, oh, well, I went to the store and such happened. You can't prove that. How do you prove that, right? Somebody would have had to actually have been there. And even if you have video of that, how do we know that's the whole story? How do we know that something else didn't happen before that? Blah, 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 blah. The list goes on. So I would beg people to be eternally skeptical of everything, but not to the point to where you just ignore reality. You just, you see reality and you're like, yeah, I don't know if reality is real. At some point, the preponderance of the evidence should be enough to have you step over that line. Okay, we really did land on the moon, folks. Certainly. There should be enough evidence to prove that we landed on the moon. But yet some people, or like the world is a sphere. It's an oblate spheroid. Kind of pear-shaped, but not, just similar. It's smaller at the top than it is at the bottom for whatever reason. All right. We don't know exactly why. I mean, sure, you could explain it with math, and you can explain it with physics, but that doesn't really get to the root of why. And I think a lot of people get stuck on the facts, or they'll get stuck on this other aspect, and they'll go down a path of destruction, and they get to a point to where it's habit to do these things. It's habit to go down this path, this rabbit hole of information. And you're like, I've got facts on my side though. Sure, but you know, just because you have the facts on your side doesn't mean you're ignoring you're not ignoring the reality of the situation. You know, doesn't mean you're not ignoring certain facts that would dispute what you're saying, that would run counter to your ideas. So I'm just saying to everybody, let's be fair. Sometimes we need to zoom out. And I think that's all I got on this one, y'all. I want y'all to let me know what y'all think about all this down in the comment section, though. Hopefully, you're still here. All right, because I know I'm kind of long-winded sometimes, but, you know, hopefully you're still around and you get the full message on this. But, you know, I think that's all I got on this one. I want to thank everybody for watching, and y'all try to have a good day. Stay legitical. Peace.